You have 24 hours before we shut your power off permanently, and then we'll take that estate piece by piece. Evelyn Harrow said, standing on my gravel drive like she owned the ground beneath my boots, and she meant every word. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. My name is Nathaniel Cross. I'm 58 years old, and for the last decade, I've lived on a stretch of land just outside Boulder that most people drive past without understanding what they're looking at. 42 acres, rolling pines, a private lake that mirrors the sky at dawn, and a stone estate house that stood longer than most of the people trying to control it. My grandfather built it in 1949, back when land was still something you earned with sweat instead of signatures. The place smells like old cedar and iron, like history. Every morning, I walk the same path along the ridge, boots pressing into gravel, coffee steaming in my hand, watching the fog lift off the water. It's quiet, or at least it used to be. The trouble didn't arrive all at once. It came in phases, subtle at first. New construction down the valley, trees cleared, roads carved into what used to be untouched land. Then came the houses, identical beige, lined up like soldiers. And with them, the HOA. They called it Silver Ridge Estates. I called it a slow invasion. At first, they ignored me. My property sat just outside their neat little boundaries, legally separate, grandfathered, untouchable. I liked it that way. I kept to myself, paid my taxes, maintained my land. No violations, no complaints, just peace. Then Evelyn Harrow moved in. You could hear her before you saw her. The sharp clicking of heels against pavement, the kind of sound that announces authority whether you respect it or not. Mid-50s, always dressed like she had somewhere more important to be, clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon. HOA president within 3 months of arriving. That told me everything I needed to know. The first time she came up my drive, I was repairing a fence post near the eastern line. She didn't greet me, didn't introduce herself, just stood there, surveying my land like it needed her approval. This property is creating inconsistencies with the community standards, she said, as if she were reading from script. I remember straightening up slowly, wiping dust from my hands, taking my time before answering. Good thing I'm not part of your community, I told her. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Over the next 2 weeks, I started getting letters, certified, stamped, formal. Notices about visual disruptions, unauthorized land usage, non-compliant infrastructure. They reference codes that didn't apply to me, rules written long after my land was legally established. I filed them away, one by one, documenting everything. I've learned over the years, quiet people win by keeping records. Then came the inspections. Utility trucks I didn't authorize. Contractors walking my boundary lines, taking photos, measuring distances. Every time I asked questions, I got the same answer. HOA directive. It escalated fast. One morning, I woke up to find a temporary notice posted at the base of my driveway. Bright red lettering, impossible to ignore. Utility review pending. Service subject to termination. I stood there longer than I should have, reading it twice, then a third time. The air smelled like damp earth and pine needles, same as always, but something had shifted. That quiet I used to count on? Gone. By the end of that week, Evelyn came back. This time she brought 2 men in pressed shirts, lawyers, or something close enough. They didn't waste time. She stepped forward, heels grinding into my gravel like she was staking a claim. You've refused multiple compliance requests, she said, voice cold, practiced. Effective immediately, we are exercising our authority to suspend utility access to this property until violations are resolved. I looked past her to the hills, the trees, the land my family had held for 75 years, and then back at her. You don't have that authority, I said calmly. She smiled, not the kind of smile that shows warmth, the kind that shows teeth. We already do. And just like that, the war started. By the following Monday, they made good on the threat. The power went out at 6:12 in the evening, right when the mountain air starts turning sharp and the last light slides across the stone columns on the west side of my house. 1 second the lamps were glowing warm against the old wood paneling. The next, silence. The hum of refrigeration died. The climate system cut out. Half the security grid went dark before the backup batteries kicked in. With a faint mechanical whine from the utility room below, I stood in the kitchen listening to the sudden stillness settle over the estate like a challenge. There's a particular kind of quiet that isn't peace, it's sabotage. My freezer held enough food for weeks. My wine cellar had its own protected cooling system. The water pumps for the lake filtration ran through independent controls. Whoever orchestrated that shutdown either didn't understand what they were touching or thought they could force me to panic before I had time to think. Evelyn was betting on the second one. At 6:27, her email came through. She didn't call. People like her prefer paper trails when they think the paper trail makes them look legitimate. The message was short, smug, and written in the kind of sanitized corporate language cowards use when they want misconduct to sound procedural. Utility suspension remains in effect pending compliance review and assessment of damages owed to Silver Ridge Estates HOA. Damages. The word sat there on the screen like a rotten tooth. I read it once, then forwarded it to a private address I use for sensitive records. After that, I walked downstairs and checked every panel myself. I've never believed in outsourcing common sense. The main shutoff had not failed. No storm damage. No transformer issue from the county. The interruption had been isolated, targeted. My estate had been separated from power by human choice. That mattered. By sunrise the next morning, I was already moving. Not loudly, not emotionally, just methodically. I called the county utility office first. A young technician answered, then transferred me twice before an older supervisor named Grant took over. His voice changed the moment he pulled the address. "Mr. Cross," he said carefully, "according to the field notes, your service was disconnected by order connected to a private easement dispute." I leaned back in my chair, staring through the study window at the pines lifting in the wind. "There is no easement dispute," I said. "There's trespass, coercion, and interference." A pause. Paper shuffling. Then Grant lowered his voice. "Off the record, the request came through with HOA counsel copied and with supporting utility access language that looked unusually aggressive." "Who signed it?" I asked. Another pause. "Evelyn Harrow." I thanked him, hung up, and wrote the time down to the minute. Then I drove into town. The courthouse records annex sits in a squat brick building that smells like toner, dust, and old municipal grudges. It's one of my favorite places in the county because documents don't care about status. They don't care about perfume, white luxury SUVs, or polished smiles. They care about signatures, dates, chain of title, beneficial interest. Facts. I spent 4 hours there pulling everything tied to Silver Ridge Estates. Plats, incorporation filings, development finance statements, utility carve-outs, lender notices. By noon, I had something more interesting than proof of harassment. I had a map of how their little kingdom was funded. The subdivision hadn't been built with cash. Of course it hadn't. Developments like they're always stacked on borrowed money, layered with liens, cross-default clauses, and paper so dense it takes a patient mind to untangle it. Most people stop at the surface. I never have. Evelyn had assumed my estate was just old land wrapped around old money. Quiet, insulated, decorative. What she hadn't bothered to learn was that I'd spent 23 years in distressed lending before I disappeared into private life. I know what debt smells like. It smells like panic hidden under expensive ink. 2 afternoons later, one of Evelyn's contractors crossed the line from nuisance to stupidity. I came back from the lower gate and found a trenching crew parked along my eastern service lane, bright orange markers stabbed into my grass like they were already claiming it. One of them had clipped a buried conduit cover near the guest house. Not enough to cut anything, but enough to tell me they were probing. I stepped out of my truck, and the foreman looked up with that uncomfortable expression men get when they've been sent on a land they know they shouldn't be touching. "Who authorized this?" I asked. He shifted his weight. "Community utility reroute," he said. "We were told these lines may fall under shared access review." "By who?" He swallowed. "Ms. Harrow's office." I nodded once, took out my phone, photographed everything. The machine tracks, the disturbed soil, the marker placements, the company logo on the truck door. Then I asked a second question. Did she tell you this estate was collateral protected? He blinked, confused. Sir, that's what I thought. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply told him to remove every marker and back that equipment off my land before the sheriff arrived to document commercial trespass. He gave the order faster than I expected. Men who work around machinery learn to recognize real danger. That evening, as the generators carried the house in a low, steady thrum, I sat alone in my study with the file boxes open around me. Dusk pressed blue against the windows. My grandfather's brass desk lamp threw a pool of gold over development loans, servicing agreements, and county filings. And there, nestled inside the financing packet for Phase 1 of Silver Ridge Estates, was the detail that changed the entire temperature of the fight. The mortgage servicing rights for the homeowner's loans had been assigned, through layered holding entities, into a private portfolio under my control 18 months earlier. I didn't smile. People assume revenge begins with anger. It doesn't. Real revenge begins with clarity. Evelyn Harrow thought she had shut off my power. In truth, she had just switched on mine. The next morning, I sent the email. Short, measured, carefully worded in the exact tone Evelyn expected from someone she believed was cornered. Ms. Harrow, I wrote, I'm prepared to cooperate in resolving the compliance concerns raised by the HOA. Please advise on next steps to restore utility access. I am willing to discuss outstanding assessments. I read it twice before sending, removing anything that sounded defiant, anything that hinted at leverage. What remained was submission, or at least the performance of it. Her response came faster than I anticipated. 9 minutes. That alone told me how closely she'd been watching. Mr. Cross, she replied, we're pleased to see a shift toward cooperation. Full restoration of services will require immediate payment of accumulated penalties, estimated damages, and compliance processing fees. A formal total will be delivered today. I leaned back in my chair, letting the faint hum of the backup system fill the room. She didn't ask for negotiation. She didn't ask for documentation. She jumped straight to extraction. That's what unchecked authority does. It accelerates greed. By noon, a courier arrived at my gate. Not mail, hand-delivered. Inside the envelope was a packet thick enough to feel important, printed on expensive stock, stamped with HOA insignia like it carried weight beyond paper. The number at the bottom of the page was almost impressive in its arrogance. $186,450. Broken down into categories that read like fiction: infrastructure disruption liability, community devaluation impact, non-compliance escalation penalties. I let out a slow breath, not because of the amount, but because of the overreach. They weren't just pushing boundaries. They were rewriting them entirely. Perfect. I signed the acknowledgement receipt without argument. No protest. No correction. The security camera over the gate captured the entire exchange. My calm posture, the courier's confirmation, the timestamp. Documentation wasn't a habit for me. It was oxygen. That afternoon, I drove down to Silver Ridge Estates for the first time since the power cut. I made sure to arrive at the exact hour people were home. Cars in driveways, garage doors open, the low murmur of suburban routine settling in. Optics matter. Evelyn was standing near the clubhouse when I pulled up, flanked by 2 board members who looked like they'd memorized her posture. She saw me immediately and smiled. That same sharp, curated smile that said she believed the outcome was already decided. I stepped out of my truck slowly, hands visible, posture relaxed. No confrontation. No raised voice. Ms. Harrow, I said evenly, holding the packet in one hand, I received your assessment. She crossed her arms, chin lifting slightly. And I'd like to resolve this without further conflict, I said. I watched her eyes carefully as I spoke, tracking the moment her confidence deepened, the exact second she decided I'd folded. It was subtle, but it was there. She gestured toward the clubhouse doors. Let's discuss terms, she said, already turning as if I would follow. Inside, the room smelled like polished wood and overbrewed coffee. The kind of place designed to feel official without actually being authoritative. She took a seat at the head of a long table, leaving the opposite side open for me, positioning always positioning. I sat without hesitation. Payment in full restores utility access within 72 hours, she said, sliding a document across the table. Additionally, we'll require a signed agreement acknowledging HOA oversight moving forward. There was not just money, control. She wanted jurisdiction. I picked up the document, scanning it slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel uncomfortable. Then I nodded once. Understood, I said. One of the board members shifted in his seat, surprised. Evelyn didn't hide her satisfaction. Good, she replied. I knew you'd see reason. I set the paper down carefully. I'll need 2 days to arrange the funds, I added. Of course, she said quickly. Too quickly. She didn't want time for me to think. She wanted time for herself to solidify what she believed was victory. As I stood to leave, she added one more detail, one she probably thought was procedural, insignificant. We'll also be conducting a full audit of your property infrastructure once access is restored, she said, to ensure compliance moving forward. I paused at the doorway, just long enough to acknowledge the statement. I understand, I said quietly. But what I understood and what she thought I understood were two very different things. Over the next 48 hours, I played the role perfectly. I transferred a partial payment, just enough to validate her expectations. I sent follow-up emails confirming my intent to comply. I allowed her contractors back onto the outer perimeter, under observation, always under observation. And each time they stepped further, each time they documented, touched, adjusted, or rerouted something they had no legal authority to control, they added another layer to what was already becoming something much bigger than an HOA dispute. Evelyn grew bolder by the hour. You could see it in the way she moved, the way she spoke to her board, the way her emails shifted from formal to directive. She wasn't just enforcing rules anymore. She was exercising power she believed no one could challenge. And that belief, that blind, escalating confidence was exactly what I needed. Because the more she acted like she owned my property, the easier it would be to prove she never did. The third morning, just after sunrise, they came in numbers. Not 2 contractors this time, not a cautious inspection crew testing boundaries. This was organized, deliberate. 3 utility trucks rolled up the main drive, followed by a black SUV I recognized immediately. Evelyn stepped out first, heels hitting the gravel with that same sharp authority. But now there was something else in her posture, something heavier. Confidence, yes, but also urgency. The kind that comes from someone who needs control to stay intact. I watched from the upper balcony as they spread out across the estate grounds like they'd already been given ownership. Orange vests, clipboards, equipment cases. One of the trucks backed toward the primary junction box that fed the estate's main power line, the exact node that controlled both external supply and backup integration. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to make the shutdown permanent. I walked downstairs slowly, not rushing, not reacting. The front door opened with its usual low creak, and the cold morning air carried the scent of diesel and disturbed soil. By the time I reached them, Evelyn was already issuing instructions. Disconnect the secondary feeds, she said, pointing toward the side panel. We don't want any unauthorized rerouting once the main line is terminated. One of the technicians hesitated. Ma'am, this looks like a private grid integration. We may need... You have authorization, she cut him off sharply, holding up a folder. Signed and documented. Proceed. He glanced at the paper, uncertain, then nodded. That hesitation, brief, almost invisible, was all I needed to confirm what I already knew. She wasn't operating within legal certainty. She was pushing them forward with pressure, not authority. I stepped closer, boots crunching against gravel, making sure my presence was known without interrupting. Evelyn turned, saw me, and smiled like she'd been waiting for this moment. Mr. Cross, she said smoothly, you're just in time. We're finalizing utility compliance measures. Finalizing? I asked calmly. Permanent disconnection, she clarified, until full settlement is complete. And until we've ensured there are no independent systems bypassing HOA control. There it was. not just enforcement domination. I nodded once, as if absorbing the information. And you believe you have the authority to do that? I asked. She didn't hesitate. We don't believe, she said, voice tightening slightly. We know. That was the moment, the point where arrogance crosses into liability. I shifted my weight slightly, angling myself just enough for the small black camera clipped to my jacket to capture everything. Her face, her words, the workers, the equipment. Every second recorded, every instruction preserved. Behind her, the crew had already begun. Metal panels opened with hollow clangs. Wires exposed. One technician cut into a conduit that fed directly into my backup relay system, something no HOA, no private entity had jurisdiction over. The sharp snap of insulated cutters slicing through that line echoed louder than it should have. It wasn't just a sound, it was evidence. Evelyn didn't flinch. In fact, she leaned into it. Make sure it's fully isolated, she called out. We don't want any residual flow. If we have to replace the entire junction, we will. Replace. Destroy. Override. Each word stacked on top of the last, building a case she didn't even realize she was constructing against herself. I walked a few steps closer, stopping just outside her immediate space. This will affect more than compliance, I said. Evenly. You're interfering with protected infrastructure. She laughed softly, not amused but dismissive. You're still trying to posture, she said. It's over, Mr. Cross. You had your chance to cooperate. Now we're enforcing resolution. Behind her, one of the workers called out. Main lines cut. The estate fell silent again, deeper this time. Even a backup hum flickered, strained by the forced isolation. Evelyn turned back toward me, satisfaction written across her face like she'd just closed a deal. Consider this your final notice, she said. No power. No negotiation leverage. You either pay or you lose everything. I held her gaze for a long second, long enough for her confidence to settle in, to root itself completely. Then I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not agreement, acknowledgement. Because in that moment, with the lines cut, the system disabled, and her standing there in full control of what she believed was the outcome, she had just committed the one mistake you can't walk back from. She didn't just shut off my power. She destroyed collateral tied to secured assets. Assets her entire neighborhood depended on without even knowing it. And she did on record, in broad daylight, with witnesses, with signatures, with intent. The trucks began to pull back shortly after, their job done, leaving behind silence and the faint smell of burnt insulation. Evelyn lingered a moment longer, watching me as if expecting some kind of reaction. Anger, panic, desperation. I gave her none. That seemed to confuse her more than anything else. We'll be in touch, she said finally, turning toward her SUV. I watched her leave without a word. The gravel settled. The estate stood quiet. And somewhere beneath that quiet, everything shifted, because from this point forward, it wasn't about defending my property anymore. It was about collecting on a debt she had just made impossible to repay. That night, I didn't restore anything. I didn't call an electrician, didn't argue with the county, didn't even attempt to reconnect the lines they'd cut. I let the estate sit in engineered silence, dark in all the right places, active in all the ones they couldn't see. Because at this stage, restoration would have been a mistake. Pressure had to build, not release. Instead, I focused on documentation. Every second of footage from that morning was backed up, duplicated, and time-stamped across 3 separate systems: visual, audio, and thermal logs from the infrastructure panels. I annotated each clip myself, marking the moment tools touched restricted conduits, the exact phrasing of Evelyn's commands, the technician hesitations she overrode. But evidence of destruction was only one side of what I needed. The other side, the part that would actually collapse her entire operation, was buried in paper. By midnight, I was back at the desk with the full financing structure of Silver Ridge spread out in front of me like a blueprint for failure. I followed the money the way I always had, quietly, patiently, without assumptions. HOA dues weren't just covering landscaping and clubhouse maintenance. They were being routed through a management entity Silver Ridge Community Services, LLC, which on paper handled operational oversight. Standard enough until I traced ownership. The LLC didn't belong to the residents. It didn't even belong to the board. It was controlled through a layered holding company registered out of Nevada, one that, after 2 more levels of indirection, tied directly back to Evelyn Harrow and a silent partner listed only as Holdings Trust. That alone wasn't illegal. Self-dealing, yes. Unethical, absolutely, but not enough. What mattered was how the money moved after it entered that structure. And that's where it got interesting. HOA funds, monthly dues, special assessments, compliance penalties were being inflated, aggregated, and then leveraged. Not reinvested into the community, leveraged against development loans tied to the very same neighborhood. They were using resident payments as artificial revenue streams to secure higher valuations on outstanding mortgages. In simple terms, they were manufacturing financial strength that didn't exist. I pulled the servicing reports tied to those mortgages, my mortgages, and compared them against the HOA's internal ledgers. The numbers didn't match, not by small margins either. Entire categories of collected funds had no corresponding deposits into the accounts that were legally required to hold them. Missing money, reclassified income, inflated asset positioning. Federal territory. Wire fraud if transmitted electronically, which it was. Bank fraud if used to influence lending terms, which it had been. And if the pattern held across all 86 homes currently financed under my portfolio, it wasn't a mistake. It was a system. I leaned back slowly, letting the weight of it settle. Not emotionally, but structurally. Evelyn hadn't just overstepped. She'd built her authority on top of a financial distortion that required constant expansion to stay hidden. That explained the aggression, the urgency, the need to force compliance, to generate penalties, to keep money flowing through channels no one else understood. And now, she'd escalated into physical interference with secured collateral. That was the fracture point. The next morning, I sent another email. Same tone, same restraint. Ms. Harrow, I wrote, I acknowledge the current status of the property and your enforcement actions. I am finalizing arrangements for the remaining balance and will coordinate access for your infrastructure audit as requested. No acquiescence, no resistance, just compliance, on paper. Her reply came with less formality this time. Good, she wrote. We'll have a full team on site within 48 hours. We need unrestricted access to ensure there are no additional violations affecting the community's financial standing. Financial standing. There was again slipped into language that sounded procedural but carried something else underneath. She wasn't worried about aesthetics anymore. She was protecting a number, one that couldn't afford disruption. Over the next 2 days, I prepared the estate exactly the way I wanted it seen. Not restored, exposed. I allowed partial access to internal systems, not enough to regain function, but enough for them to interact, to document, to interfere further. Every room they entered, every panel they opened, every adjustment they made, recorded. And while they focused on wires and circuits, I focused on signatures. I drafted a formal notice, one that wouldn't be sent yet, but one that outlined breach conditions tied to interference with collateralized infrastructure across a finance development. I attached evidence logs, financial discrepancies, ownership chains, all of it waiting. Because the truth is, foreclosure isn't triggered by anger. It's triggered by violation. And Evelyn Harrow was about to violate everything. They returned on the 48th hour exactly. No delays, no hesitation. This time it wasn't just contractors and clipboards. It was escalation in its final form. 2 flatbed trucks, a utility enforcement crew, and a man in a tailored gray suit carrying a portfolio thick enough to mean something permanent. I watched them assemble from the front steps, hands resting loosely in my pockets, the estate still dim behind me, silent by design. Evelyn stepped out last, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky, her posture sharp, composed, victorious. She didn't look around this time. She didn't need to. In her mind, this place was already under her control. Mr. Cross, she called out. voice carrying easily across the gravel. "We're here to conclude this matter." I walked down the steps slowly, meeting them halfway. Not rushed, not resistant. Just present. The man in the gray suit opened his portfolio, pulling out a document stamped with official markings meant to look heavier than they actually were. "Notice of enforcement and asset seizure authorization," he announced, reading just loud enough for the crew to hear. "Issued under the authority of Silver Ridge Estates HOA governance structure." Governance structure. Not law, not court. Structure. That distinction mattered, but not to them. Evelyn stepped closer, folding her arms as she watched my reaction. "You've had ample opportunity to comply," she said. "Payment has not been completed. Violations remain unresolved. As such, we are initiating corrective measures." Behind her, one of the crews began positioning equipment near the garage access. Metal clamps, lockout devices, physical barriers designed to restrict movement and utility use. They weren't just cutting power anymore. They were preparing to choke the property itself. "You're seizing access?" I asked, voice steady. "We're securing collateral," she corrected instantly, as if she'd rehearsed the line. That word hung in the air for a second longer than she intended. Collateral. She used it without understanding it, without realizing what it actually tied her to. I took a single step closer, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to make sure she could hear me clearly without the performance. "Are you absolutely certain," I said quietly, "that you want to proceed with this?" It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a warning in tone. It was something colder, final. Evelyn paused, just briefly. A flicker, the kind that happens when instinct tries to interrupt arrogance. Then it vanished. She smiled slow, deliberate, dismissive. "Oh, I'm certain," she said, her voice dipping into that same condescending edge she'd used from the beginning. "What I'm not certain of," she added, stepping closer, lowering her sunglasses just enough to meet my eyes directly, "is how you managed to convince yourself you had any leverage left." One of the board members behind her let out a quiet chuckle. The crew kept moving, metal scraping against concrete, locks clicking into place, barriers sliding into position across the lower access drive. She turned slightly, gesturing toward the activity like a conductor guiding a performance. "You're not dealing with some small-town committee," she continued. "We've structured this development to withstand exactly this kind of resistance." Structured. There was again the language of someone hiding financial architecture behind authority. "You built this entire situation on non-compliance," she went on, her voice sharpening. "And now you expect sympathy?" I held her gaze, unblinking. "No," I said calmly. "I expect you to understand what you're doing." She laughed, short, sharp, almost bored. "I understand perfectly," she replied. "You're out of options. You're out of time. And by the end of today, you'll be out of property." Behind her, the man in the gray suit stepped forward again, pen ready, document extended. "Final authorization signature," he said, offering it to Evelyn. She took it without hesitation. No review, no second thought, just confidence. She signed her name in a clean, practiced motion. Evelyn Harrow, bold across the line that turned posturing into action. That was it. The last door closed. The final opportunity for her to step back, gone. She handed the document back with a satisfied nod, then looked at me one more time, expecting something, anything. Anger, desperation, a plea. I gave her none, just silence. That seemed to irritate her more than resistance ever could. "You should have paid when you had the chance," she said, turning toward her SUV. "Now you'll learn what enforcement actually looks like." The engine started up behind her. Equipment locked into place. Access restricted. Control, at least in her mind, complete. I stood there as the sound settled into the air, watching her walk away with the confidence of someone who believed she had just won everything. And in that exact moment, she had lost absolutely everything. The sound reached them before the sight did. Not sirens, something quieter, more controlled. Engines. Multiple, synchronized, pulling up just beyond the main gate they had so confidently sealed. Evelyn was halfway to her SUV when she paused, her hand still resting on the door handle, head turning slightly as the low rumble rolled across the estate. The cruise slowed. One of the board members frowned, glancing toward the drive. Then the vehicles came into view, 2 black sedans, a county utility enforcement truck, and behind them, something Evelyn clearly hadn't anticipated. A legal courier van marked with Federal Registry insignia. The gate, my gate, remained closed. But that didn't matter, because I reached into my pocket, pressed a single button, and the secondary access system, the one they hadn't even realized existed, slid open with a smooth mechanical hum. Their locks, their barriers, meaningless. The vehicles rolled in without hesitation, tires crunching over gravel that still belonged to me. Evelyn's posture shifted, not dramatically. Not at first, but enough. That edge of certainty softened, replaced by something thinner. "What is this?" she demanded, turning back toward me, voice tighter than before. I didn't answer immediately. I let the moment breathe, let the weight of what was arriving settle into the space she thought she controlled. The first sedan door opened. A man stepped out, mid-60s, gray suit, the kind of presence that doesn't need volume to command attention. Behind him, 2 others followed, carrying document cases. Not contractors, not HOA counsel, something else entirely. "Mr. Cross," the man said as he approached, offering a brief nod. "We're on schedule." "Right on time," I replied. That was the moment Evelyn understood, or at least the moment she realized she didn't understand at all. "Excuse me," she cut in sharply, stepping forward. "This is private property under HOA enforcement action. You are not authorized to." "You're mistaken," the man interrupted, calm but absolute. He turned slightly, opening his case, removing a folder stamped with federal filing marks. "We are here under authority of the servicing entity responsible for the secured mortgages tied to this development." Silence followed. Not confusion, not yet. Just a gap, where her certainty used to be. "Servicing entity," one of the board members repeated under his breath. The man didn't look at them. His eyes stayed on Evelyn. "Due to documented interference with collateralized infrastructure, unauthorized modification of secured utility systems, and evidence of financial misrepresentation affecting loan valuations, immediate action has been initiated." He handed her the document. She took it automatically, reflex, not comprehension. Her eyes scanned the first page, then the second. I watched it happen in real time. The shift, the color draining, the smile collapsing. The exact second the words stopped being abstract and became real. This isn't possible," she said, voice no longer sharp, just thin. "We have full authority over or no," I said quietly, stepping forward just enough to stand beside the man. "You never did." Her head snapped toward me, eyes searching my face for something, anything that would restore the version of reality she'd been operating under. She didn't find it. "You've been collecting funds you don't legally control," I continued, my voice steady, measured. "Routing them through entities you own. Inflating valuations on properties tied to loans you never fully understood." And then I gestured lightly toward the junction box behind her, the cut line still exposed. "You interfered directly with the infrastructure securing those loans." The man beside me closed his case with a soft click. "Which triggers default conditions across the entire portfolio," he added. "Effective immediately." The word immediately landed harder than anything else. Evelyn looked back down at the document, flipping pages now, faster, more desperate. No, this is a mistake. "We have agreements, we have documentation, we have all of it," I said. "Every email, every transfer, every adjustment you thought no one would trace." One of the crew members took a step back, then another. The board member who had laughed earlier said, "Nothing now," just stared at the ground like it might open up and take him with it. "You can't," Evelyn started, but the words didn't hold. They fell apart halfway through. The man in the gray suit, the same one who had handed her the enforcement notice minutes earlier, was now standing off to the side, silent, his authority evaporated. Because the hierarchy had shifted. Completely. "You shut off my power," I said, not raising my voice, not changing my tone. "But what you actually did was trigger foreclosure on every home tied to those loans." Her head lifted slowly, eyes wide now, not angry, not defiant, afraid. That's not how this works, she whispered. It is, the man beside me confirmed. And it's already in motion. The second sedan door opened again. Another official stepped out, carrying additional documents, more notices, more signatures, more inevitability. Evelyn's hands trembled slightly as the paper slipped lower in her grip. The confidence, the control gone, replaced by the one thing she had spent this entire time trying to avoid: consequence. And standing there, in the center of a property she thought she had conquered, she finally understood who she had been dealing with all along. The shift was immediate and irreversible. Within minutes, the calm, controlled presence of those officials expanded into something far heavier. Additional vehicles arrived. Not loud, not chaotic, but precise. A county sheriff's unit rolled in behind the second sedan, followed by two more federal vehicles. Doors opened in sequence. Jackets flashed with insignia that didn't need explanation. This wasn't an HOA dispute anymore. This was enforcement. Evelyn didn't move at first. She stood there, frozen in the exact spot where her authority had just evaporated, the documents still trembling in her hand. Around her, the same people who had followed her orders minutes ago began stepping back, physically distancing themselves like proximity itself had become a liability. One of the officials approached her directly, voice calm, procedural. Evelyn Harrow. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were still locked on the pages, flipping back and forth as if the words might rearrange themselves into something safer. Ms. Harrow, he repeated, firmer this time. She looked up slowly. Yes, the response barely held. You are being formally notified of an active federal investigation into financial misrepresentation, wire fraud, and unlawful interference with secured assets tied to federally regulated lending institutions. He said, each word delivered with the kind of clarity that leaves no room for interpretation. The air changed. Not dramatically, but definitively. The kind of silence that doesn't ask questions anymore. It concludes them. No, this is a misunderstanding, Evelyn said quickly, her voice rising, trying to climb back into control. We have legal counsel, we have documentation, all of which has been reviewed, the official cut in, and all of which is now part of the case file. Another agent stepped forward, holding a second document, thicker, heavier, stamped with seals that carried actual weight. Additionally, he continued, based on evidence collected, including recorded directives authorizing the destruction and alteration of protected infrastructure, you're being placed under arrest pending further charges. That word, arrest, hit differently. It didn't echo. It settled. Evelyn's expression cracked. Not slightly, completely. You can't do this, she said, shaking her head, backing up a step. You don't understand. This is my development. I run this. Not anymore, I said quietly. She turned toward me, and for the first time since this began, there was no arrogance left. Just realization. Raw, unfiltered. The cuffs came out without drama. No ruse. No spectacle. Just procedure. Cold, precise, final. The click of metal closing around her wrist cut through the air, sharper than anything she had said in the past week. One of the board members muttered something under his breath, then turned and walked away entirely, leaving her standing there, alone, as the structure she built collapsed around her. Behind us, another team had already begun serving notices door to door across Silver Ridge. Residents stepped out onto their porches, confusion written across their faces as uniformed officials handed them documents they didn't yet understand. Foreclosure notices. Immediate. Comprehensive. The financial structure Evelyn had manipulated to create power had just been used to dismantle everything she controlled. Wait, you can't take their homes, she said suddenly, panic breaking through fully now. They're not involved. This isn't their fault. The properties are tied to the loans. The official replied evenly. The loans are tied to the violations. This is how enforcement works. She shook her head violently. No, we can fix this. I can fix this. I'll reverse everything. I'll restore the utilities. It's past that point, I said. Not cold, not cruel. Just factual. Her eyes locked onto mine, searching for something, mercy, leverage, any fragment of the control she used to have. There was none, because this wasn't a negotiation anymore. This was consequence. The gray-suited man who had once stood beside her now stood with the officials, quietly handing over internal HOA documents, records, signatures, approvals. Cooperation. Survival instinct kicking in. One by one, the people who had supported her began separating themselves from her actions, from her authority, from her. Evelyn saw it happen, and that might have been the worst part. Not the cuffs, not the charges, the abandonment. You said this was protected, she whispered, almost to herself. You said this structure couldn't be touched, no one answered, because the truth was already standing in front of her. Structures built on fraud don't protect, they collapse. As they guided her toward the vehicle, her steps unsteady now, the estate behind me came back to life, quietly, efficiently. Power restored, systems re-engaged. The low hum returned, steady and controlled, like nothing had ever been taken in the first place. Because in the end, it hadn't. She hadn't taken my power. She had only revealed where hers truly ended. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was clean. Not the forced quiet that comes after conflict, but the kind that settles in when something broken has finally been removed. Over the next few days, Silver Ridge estates changed. Not all at once. Not dramatically, but in the way structures do when pressure is released from the wrong places and applied where it actually belongs. The foreclosure notices, as severe as they sounded, didn't translate into chaos the way most people expected. That's the difference between collapse and correction. Collapse destroys indiscriminately. Correction is precise. I spent the next morning in my study, not reviewing damage, but restructuring it. The portfolio tied to Silver Ridge wasn't just a collection of loans. It was leverage, yes, but more importantly, it was responsibility. 86 homes, 86 families. Most of them had no idea what Evelyn had been doing behind the scenes, how their payments had been manipulated, how their equity had been inflated into something unstable. They weren't the problem. They were the ones who had been put at risk. By noon, I had already initiated the first adjustment. The foreclosure actions were paused, not dismissed, not erased, but restructured under a protective review status. Every homeowner received a revised notice, clear, direct, stripped of legal intimidation. No immediate eviction, no for sale. Instead, a recalibration. Loan terms corrected to reflect actual value, not fabricated projections. Payment schedules adjusted. Escrow accounts rebuilt properly, transparent, verifiable, protected. I didn't make a public announcement. I didn't need to. People notice when fear is replaced with clarity. That afternoon, I drove down into the neighborhood again. No crews this time. No officials. Just residents, standing in small groups, holding the new documents, reading them slowly, trying to understand what had just happened to their lives in the span of 72 hours. A man in his 60s approached me first. Retired, judging by the way he carried himself. Steady, cautious. "You're the one handling this now?" he asked. I nodded once. Yes. He looked down at the paper in his hands, then back at me. "This says our payments are going down," he said, almost like he didn't trust the words. "Because they were never supposed to be that high to begin with," I replied. He studied my face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "No gratitude. Not yet. Just understanding." That was enough. Over the next week, the transformation continued. The HOA, what was left of it, was dissolved under legal review. Its accounts frozen. Its authority stripped back to nothing more than a record of what had been done. In its place, a temporary oversight structure was put in, not to control, but to stabilize. Transparent guidelines. Open records. No hidden entities. No manufactured penalties. The clubhouse, once the center of Evelyn's control, became something else entirely. A place where residents could sit, ask questions, review their own financial standing without needing permission. It smelled different too, less like polished intimidation, more like something honest. Back at the estate, the repairs were simple. The lines they cut were restored, properly this time, documented, reinforced. The system came back online not with a surge, but with a steady, quiet hum. The kind that doesn't draw attention because it's working exactly as it should. One evening, just before dusk, I walked out to the edge of the property where the ridge overlooks the valley. The houses below, no longer identical in the way they had been before. Not physically, but in presence. They felt lived in now, not controlled. Lights flickered on, one by one, not as part of a system, but as choices. I stood there for a while, hands in my pockets, breathing in the same air my grandfather had worked this land under decades ago. He used to say something that didn't make much sense to me when I was younger. Ownership isn't about holding on, he'd tell me. It's about knowing what not to take. I understood it now. I could have enforced everything, taken every property, sold them off, turned profit into something measurable. But that wouldn't have restored anything. It would have just replaced one imbalance with another. What mattered was this: balance returned, not imposed. Power used, not displayed. And silence earned, not forced. Down below, someone laughed, faint, carried on the wind. Not nervous, not uncertain, just normal. And for the first time since this all began, that was enough. There is something quietly unsettling about the kind of power Evelyn believed she had, because it did not come from law, or from truth, or even from competence. It came from assumption. The assumption that most people will not question authority if it is delivered with enough confidence, enough paperwork, enough pressure. And for a while, that illusion worked. It allowed her to rewrite rules, to manipulate numbers, to turn a community into a system of control disguised as order. But what this story reveals, with almost surgical clarity, is that real power does not need to announce itself. Nathaniel never raised his voice, never rushed, never tried to dominate the situation. He simply understood the structure beneath the surface, and more importantly, he respected the weight of what ownership truly means. A home is not just walls and land. It is trust, stability, and the quiet expectation that no one can take it from you without consequence. And when that expectation is violated, the law, when applied correctly, does not bend. It corrects. So the real question becomes not who had more authority, but who understood it better. What would you have done if someone tried to cut off your power and control your property, believing you had no way to fight back? I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.